In today's video, we're going to be talking about why we're so confused about the idea of food addiction and how that ends up affecting the way that we live our life. Hello everyone, my name is Violet Reveira. I'm a psychologist. The reason I make these videos is to help people to understand how your physical and mental health come together to create an overall sense of well-being. I'm really excited to be here presenting on Adapt Your Life about the psychological effects of being addicted to food and how that affects the way that we end up living our life and eventually the weight that we're living our life at. The first thing I want to do is give you the definition of addiction so that we're all on the same page about what we're talking about. So, addiction is being physically and mentally dependent on a particular substance or activity and unable to stop taking or doing it without incurring adverse side effects. So, the first thing I'm going to point out is that when we're talking about being addicted to food, it's really, really difficult to understand how we can be addicted to food when there's a clear adverse side effect that everyone will live. So every single person on the planet will live this adverse side effect. If you don't have access to food, we will die. And so that seems clear to me that everyone would say, okay, then we have to discount food as an addictive substance because we all need it to survive. I want to go a little bit deeper and help you to understand why, yes, we can be addicted to food, the fact that we are addicted to food, and how that ends up affecting us. So because food is necessary for life, how are we able to tell if we're dependent on food, so in an addictive way? And in order to do that, we need to look at the way that we're using food. Food is fuel. And if you're using food to fuel your body, and that's the only way that you're using food, you're not addicted to food. However, if you're using food for any other reason, to solve any other problem, for example, emotional, for entertainment, if you're using food in any other way other than fueling your body, there could be an issue. When we use food to feel good and even to avoid solving problems, we're using food in a way that we become dependent on it to solve things that are unrelated to hunger, and that's a huge problem. Now, oftentimes when I talk about this, people will say to me, well, I don't do that because I don't use food when I'm sad or to make myself feel better. And the issue that I see there is that a lot of people don't recognize that when you use food to avoid being bored, and when you use food to celebrate, you're still using food in a way that's not what it's made for, and therefore it will also be affecting you. So celebrating with food is still an emotional attachment to food, bringing food into a situation where it's not serving the purpose it was made for. Now, I know there's going to be a lot of confusion here because there's a difference, and I want to be very clear about this. There's a difference between going out for a meal with friends and celebrating something with friends, and the focus is the friends and it's less about the meal, versus going out for a meal with friends to celebrate, but in actuality, my celebration is the eating of whatever I happen to be eating. And although from the outside looking in, it might look like the same behavior, the thing about addiction is that it's about how the person is experiencing the event that matters. If you go out to eat, or if you have some kind of celebration where there's food and your focus is the food rather than the people, rather than the event, you need to understand that your interaction with food, therefore, is about a dependence on the food to give you something other than fuel. That's going to be really important for you to understand if you're trying to overcome any kind of metabolic issue, any kind of weight issue. Because even getting the food under control, the emotional connection to the food is there. One of the issues that we notice is that when we become very focused on the food and less focused on the interaction, even if this might have started out where baking or cooking was some kind of hobby for me that I got to share with friends and family, when my focus is more on the consumption of the food than the sharing with friends and interacting with other people, rather than the researching recipes what ends up happening for us is that our social circle, first of all, becomes diminished. And the reason for this is when my focus is more on the meal than the person, whoever I happen to be interacting with or the people that I happen to be interacting with are going to feel that from me. So I'm going to end up alienating people in the way that I'm putting food before them. I'm going to end up creating scenarios where people are either uncomfortable to have meals with me because, again, my focus isn't them, or I'm not even going to invite people to share the food with me because their presence isn't necessary. My sole investment is actually in the food I'm eating. I'm getting my emotional comfort from that. I'm getting my entertainment from that. I'm basically replacing the need for people with food. Again, it's not going to be that obvious at the beginning. But eventually, if I get to this place with food where the meal is more important than the people start to feel it. The more that we eat, the more that our body produces dopamine from the carbohydrate hit, and the more insulin is available in our system. Now, both of these situations will contribute to us needing to eat more. First of all, the dopamine hit that we get pushes us to want to eat more carbs. And the insulin that's in our system puts those carbs away. And as soon as we put the carbs away, our body's going to need more energy. And so we're constantly needing to continue to fuel ourselves. If I'm the kind of person that gets a lot of pleasure out of eating food, that could lead me onto a road where I actually begin to eat large amounts of food. And this becomes problematic because it's normal to eat. We all eat. It's normal to eat a normal amount of food. Everybody does this. It becomes abnormal to eat large, excessive amounts of food. And the unfortunate reality is, for some people, getting into this situation where I'm very invested in food as my entertainment. I'm very invested in food as my source of comfort. I'm very invested in food for multiple different reasons. All of a sudden, I'm eating more food than looks normal to the average person. But I'm also going to notice that. So what's going to happen? As with most addictive behaviors, we become hesitant to show people how much food we're actually eating. So again, part of the problem with using food for emotional and distraction purposes rather than fueling our body is that when we become excessive in the amount of food that we eat, and then we notice that we're eating much more than everybody else, because we're addicted to the behavior by that point, we hide what we're doing. And now, not only are we not bringing food to the center of attention with our friends and family because they're not interesting as much as the food, but also the food becomes such a focus and I have to have it that I would rather not spend time with you because I have to do this. Unfortunately, at that point, our focus is so much on eating and fueling this dopamine roller coaster that we happen to be on, and the insulin is very desperately trying to get that sugar out of our system, that we're out of control where our eating is concerned. Part of the issue starts from way back when we're younger. Food is used inappropriately, even with young children. Unfortunately, we use food as a reward system and a punishment system. Many children don't get dessert if they don't behave well, and get the sugary desserts if they behave really well. And by doing this, we are encouraging children to link positive emotional reactions from their parents, so that positive encouragement that they're getting, to sugary snacks and foods. It's not obvious to us, although it should be, that we're creating a story where later on, to reward myself, I'm going to give myself sugary snacks, sugary rewards, but also that when I feel bad and I need to make myself feel better, so when I'm trying to soothe myself, those are going to be the foods that I go towards because those are the things that I remember being given to me as rewards. Sugary foods and snacks given to children as a way to entice them to do better behaviors is very negative for the child because it's creating the adult that feels like these sugary foods and snacks, which gives that kid a dopamine hit. So it's going to give that kid and that adult a dopamine hit, that this feeling that is what I'm chasing in order to know what feeling good feels like. The emotional love and attention that we get from a parent's hug or a parent's love and affection is a different type of positive. It's oxytocin. And that is a different positive that also can help us to behave well, but doesn't produce this negative side effects of an insulin spike and then insulin trying to put sugar away. We need to focus our attention on making sure that we're teaching our children to use food for fuel rather than using food as a reward/punishment system with our children. The other problematic thing that we do with food that causes it to be addictive is to use food as a distraction. So it's not uncommon to see people, when they're bored, go and look for something to eat, to get a snack. It's not uncommon that we'd actually make this into an activity, right? That we would be bored and we'll get up and we'll either jump on our bike, or get in our car, or go for a walk towards the local dépanneur or store to buy some chips or cookies or ice cream or something that we're going to then turn around and go home and indulge in these foods as a way of distracting ourselves from the fact that we're bored. The problem is that as soon as we're finished eating those things, we're still bored because food is for fuel, not entertainment. And yet in this case, we're trying to use food as an activity, something to entertain us. Unfortunately, again, with children, we use food as a distraction. A lot of the times I will either see parents or hear them say that they do this, where they will have a child who's behaving poorly, a young child, maybe a toddler, and in an effort to redirect the child's behavior, rather than give the child a toy or give the child something more appropriate to do, the parent will give the child a bottle or give the child a cookie. So distracting them from the poor behavior with eating behavior, even though clearly the child is not hungry and that wasn't the reason for the poor behavior. It's really important for us to think, again, what am I telling my child when I do this? And is this part of how we end up creating adults that do similar behaviors? Oh, I'm bored. I'm going to go to the store and buy something to eat. Even with older children, I see this kind of behavior as well, because I might hear a story where a parent is telling me, well, the kid came back from a friend's house and the friend wasn't being nice to them. And to distract them out of this negative thought process that was hurting their feelings, they start talking to the kid about, well, today we're going to go out for supper and we're going to do this and that. And basically moving the child from a distressing social situation that they didn't know how to manage to, don't worry about your friend being not nice to you. We're going to go out to eat and everything's going to be okay. We need to learn how to solve our social situations rather than pretend that they're not happening. So when we distract ourselves from social situations that are hurtful, when we distract ourselves from negative scenarios in our lives, whether they're happening at work, whether they're happening with family, or whether they're happening with friends, whether we failed at something and we don't know what to do about it, if we distract ourselves with food so that we're not thinking about it in the moment, it doesn't solve the problem. And eventually that problem will be back in front of us. So the small distraction that we might have gotten for a few moments isn't helping us long term. But the problem is the small distraction that we got in that few moments created a physiological reaction and a psychological link that we are creating. And the more times we make that link, the better it's going to be hardwired into us that that's the answer, even though clearly it's not. Unfortunately, we confuse ourselves about food because we don't use it correctly. By allowing ourselves to use it incorrectly, we don't see the part where there are some very intrinsic things about food that encourage us to eat because eating keeps us alive. And so by eating food, our body feels good. By eating food, we build a body. If we eat the good foods, we build a healthy body. By building a healthy body, we're stronger and better able to manage in our world. And this has kept us alive for thousands of years. But when we confuse ourselves with food and we don't recognize that carbohydrates create a dopamine reaction that gets us to chase more carbohydrates, all of a sudden we're building a less than optimal body. We're creating significant inflammation in our bodies. We are creating an attachment to food that's not healthy, that causes us to be overweight, that causes us to be mentally fatigued because we're eating the wrong types of energy. that causes our bodies to function suboptimally. And this roller coaster that we're on, because this emotional attachment to food, even when we solve the metabolic part by doing a ketogenic lifestyle, that psychological attachment to the sweet taste of stuff is there. And many people who get into a ketogenic lifestyle but struggle and continue to allow sugary foods into their life, whether they taste sugary because of real sugar or they taste sugary because of sugar alcohols or stevia or these kind of things, eventually that cephalic response that we're having does encourage our body to put extra carbohydrates away, confusion about carbs versus stevia, but also encourages us to want more carbohydrate foods. So actual carbohydrate foods, that carb creep that happens when we eat too many nuts, too much cheese, too much of the vegetables that have like a lot of carbohydrates in them, like potatoes. And right, when we allow these things into our lives, we need to understand part of the reason that that's happening to us is because that psychological connection that we have to that taste and that dopamine hit that we get when we have carbohydrates in a large number is still there. So psychologically, we still want the emotional, oh, that makes me feel good, that emotional hug that we get from eating sweet things, even though we know that physiologically it's hurting us. I want everyone to understand that you have the ability to address this, but in order to address it, you need to understand what's happening, because eating something sweet doesn't solve the problem. Taking the time to solve the problem is actually what solves the problem. I want every person who's living a ketogenic lifestyle, first of all, to understand that taking the carbs out, but not addressing the psychological need I have to eat comfort foods, will very likely encourage you to continue to make things that are very processed and therefore ingest too many carbs. So for example, when you find yourself wanting to bake keto-friendly cakes and cookies and all these things, but then one keto-friendly piece of cake could still give me about 5 grams of carbs, which is still 25% of my daily intake. How does that affect my day? And do I stick to my portion? These things are really important. Dr. Westman has often told us to be careful of carb creep because it's something that actually happens. You let in a piece of cake, then tomorrow maybe I have a piece of cake and a half. Next thing you know, I've had too many carbs and I'm chasing it again. It's really important to understand that this is happening because emotionally we're connected to that dopamine hit that we used to get when we were allowing these carby foods into our life. It's important for us to understand that emotionally the taste of sweet makes us remember the times where we used to take care of ourselves, so soothe ourselves with food. It isn't solving the problem. Let's use food in the way that it was intended to be used. That means fueling our body appropriately, building the best possible body we can so that we can replace the negatives that we might be living right now with a strong, healthy, positive body in the next 6 to 7 years, because that's how long it takes for all of the body cells to be replaced. So we're aiming always long term. Think long term. Your health is about long term, not short term. And then that we are going to be able to use our body to do what we want to be able to do. I want to thank Adapt Your Life for letting me present again. If you want to follow me, you can go to Mind Blowing Health and Wellness with Violet, where I have a channel about how physical health and mental health come together to create your overall sense of well-being. And I talk a lot about weight and living a ketogenic lifestyle so that you can use low carb to make sure that you're building the best possible body that you can. Thank you guys for watching. Subscribe to Adapt Your Life. And if you'd like to, come by and subscribe to my channel. I'll talk to you next time.